Hello and welcome to the third and final day of the Greenlight Guru True Quality Virtual Summit. I hope you've had a chance to enjoy the last few days of learning actionable tips, trends, and best practices to achieve true quality for your medical device and company. This session is titled The Post-COVID Value Shift and How MedTech Companies Can Capitalize. My name is Nick Tittman. I'm the VP of Marketing here at Greenlight Guru, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. I know our speaker, Richard Charter, is really looking forward to sharing how the MedTech industry can benefit from the value shift caused by COVID and how you can align your organization and engage with key stakeholders to capitalize on the opportunity. Before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our speaker and his company, Alira Health, I'm going to touch on a few housekeeping items real quick. First, the session is going to run for about 45 minutes in total and will include a Q&A session at the end where Richard has been kind enough to answer your questions. So I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation as they come up in the box on the right-hand side, and we will get to as many of them as time permits. And yes, this entire session is being recorded, and the slides will be available to download after the event. Once this session wraps up, there's about a 10-minute break before the next session goes live. If you're interested in learning about how to get your COVID-19 related medical device to market under the FDA EUA, make sure to register for the next session and use your unique link to tune in. I'd also like to share a couple of words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on this free virtual summit. If you've been to one of our training sessions before, then you know we put these on because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru. Likely a similar mission as many of you on today's summit. Anything we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker with less risk aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to fulfill that mission, whether that's through hosting these free events and training sessions, through partnering with world-class medical device consultancies like Alira Health, or through our award-winning medical device QMS software. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies from across the globe are moving away from paper-based and general purpose quality management systems and adopting our purpose-built medical device QMS software platform, I encourage you to head on over to www.greenlight.guru after today's session and schedule your free personalized demo. All right, now on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give you a proper introduction to today's presenter, Richard Charter. Richard is the Vice President, Europe and Asia Pacific MedTech Market Access at Alira Health, a global advisory firm providing strategy, execution, and innovation services for healthcare and life science companies. Richard has over 15 years experience in the financial and health economics. He was the former head of market access and pricing at a major MedTech company and has worked on projects across multiple care delivery settings and therapeutic areas. Richard has focused on evidence requirements, payer engagement, and value-based healthcare. He is the past chair of the MedTech Europe Evidence and Payer Working Group and was grant provider to the initial MedTech Europe Value-Based Procurement Working Group. He is currently the co-chair of the ISPOR Medical Device Special Interest Group, chairperson of the MedTech Europe Evidence and Payers Working Group, and the industry advisor to the EU-funded Horizon 2020 COMED initiative on cost and outcome measurements for medical devices. Richard graduated from SDA Franchi, where he was obtained a master's degree in healthcare management, economics, and policy. Richard also has completed the Harvard Business School intensive course on value-based healthcare and has successfully helped guide various market access and value-based healthcare pilot projects all across Europe. So without further ado, let me hand it over to your presenter for today, Richard. Take it away.
Thank you. Can I just confirm you can hear me before I begin?
Yep, loud and clear.
Wonderful, thank you. So thank you for the introduction. I think that's the first time I've had someone read the entire intro. So thank you, I appreciate it. As mentioned, my name is Richard Charter. I'm the Vice President of MedTech Market Access, Europe and Asia Pacific for Alira Health. And I just wanted to give you a presentation today on how MedTech companies can adapt to this COVID and post-COVID environment. Just a quick sort of caveat before I go on. So it's really difficult to talk about a pandemic and not talk about public health and epidemiological issues, but I am by no means a public health expert, nor am I an epidemiologist, but everything I'm presenting is taken from experts in that area. So I just want to be clear about my background. I'm a health economist and not an epidemiologist, just to put that caveat out there. But I think we can take a lot of interesting stuff out of this session. And again, please feel free to follow up with me afterwards or ask a question towards the end of this session. So a couple of quick disclaimers. I represent the following organizations, and these views do not necessarily represent those of these organizations or their affiliates. Just put this up here just for disclaimer purposes. And a little bit more background. So I actually did an article on this topic, posted it over LinkedIn. So if you'd like to see it a little bit more, feel free to jump over to my LinkedIn profile where you can find this. And essentially, it's the written version of this presentation, and hopefully you'll take some value out of that too. So again, reach out to me if you've got any questions on that. So what will we cover today? So I hope to talk for maybe 30 minutes and then have 15 minutes of Q&A. But really, what I'd like to talk about are the pre-COVID value challenges and why healthcare is a little bit unique. I think this is often overlooked in healthcare circles. So I just want to touch on that for a moment. Then I want to talk about how health systems have changed as a result of COVID, and I'll source some literature that's come up recently on pandemic preparedness and planning. We'll also talk about how these changes can benefit MedTech companies. I do believe that this shift in healthcare resourcing globally will probably mean good things in the long run for medical device and MedTech companies overall. And then last and arguably most important, how can you align your organization to this new normal, and what do you need to do next to make sure you're adapting appropriately? So if we cover off those, hopefully you'll find the time well spent today. So why is healthcare unique? I put this slide up because as mentioned in my intro, I don't actually come from a healthcare background. I come from a finance background, and I kind of got into health economics a little bit later on in my career after spending the majority of my time in financial economics. And the first thing that jumped out to me is how different healthcare is. And in fact, I think it's the only industry out there that's got the following characteristics. So there's three completely distinct set of actors in healthcare. And again, this does not exist in any other industry. And when you're dealing with these distinct stakeholders, it ends up with what I call a unique value challenge. So the first one is the physician, and that's the person who often recommends that medical technology or that pharmaceutical drug or whatever the intervention happens to be. And they've got one set of very interesting and unique ways on how they would define value for a medical technology. And typically, this is where the medical technology industry is focused. So we find our key thought leaders, who are often doctors, physicians in hospitals or care facilities, and then we'll try and drive an innovation through these champions in various healthcare ecosystems. And then we try to align it to what the patient benefit is. So sometimes, obviously, our products will be defined in terms of patient outcomes, but the majority of the time, these are the two stakeholders that we focus on. It's the physician and the patient. But almost never until the last, let's say, 10, 15 years, I would probably say en masse since the financial crisis, have we really focused on this payer. So healthcare is the only industry on the planet that's got a complete separation of the person using the product, the physician, the person who benefits from it, the patient, and then the person who pays for it, the payer. And that sets us up for a unique dynamic, which I think in this COVID environment is both amplified and changes slightly on how we look at things going forward. So with that in mind, it begs the question, how do we adapt to this? But I think there's another area that we need to consider as well. And these are macro trends that we see globally. I focus mostly on Europe and Asia Pacific, but I think we could say they're in the United States as well. And those are the following. So if we take that value challenge and then we look at the various macro trends that are emerging in healthcare, we see that healthcare's got an interesting situation that they need to provide the highest quality healthcare to maximize health population outcomes. And making sure that we juggle that in the context of limited budgets and rapidly growing demand is an incredible challenge. So all around the world, we've seen budgets come down. We've seen the increased incidence of chronic illness and more costly interventions that go on for longer periods of time. So healthcare systems really need to adapt and figure out how they can service all of these rising demands despite lower budgets. And then last but not least, certainly in Europe, how do you ensure equality and universal healthcare coverage to maximize, again, that population health from a universal perspective? So these two key domains, one, that unique situation that the healthcare industry finds itself in, coupled with the macroeconomic trends we see emerge, has led to some very difficult questions and some very challenging environments for the stakeholders in healthcare. And I believe that the solution to this is incredibly simple in theory, but it becomes very complex when we look to execute on it. And I think it comes out of Harvard University from Michael Porter, and this is that definition of value-based healthcare, which we've probably seen circulate around in various healthcare topics and discussions. And very simply, if we define value as health outcomes by the total cost of delivering those outcomes, I think we've gone a long ways in aligning stakeholders and overcoming those three critical challenges. And again, I think the question becomes, how do we do this in the context of COVID-19, and what does this mean for us going forward on that? Because by any measure, healthcare needs a transformation, and COVID-19 has accelerated this. So let's walk through some of the examples on how we do this and what exactly we can adapt on to move forward. So the first thing I like to articulate in all of this is that the way MedTech was currently doing business, it's changed. So we have seen a typical environment, as I mentioned, where the sales teams will engage with key clinician thought leaders. They will drive product adoption through, these champions on site. But as we start to see payers come into the environment more, we see that it's becoming much more challenging. Payers will have formularies, they'll have procurement decisions, which mitigate a medical technology from even being put into a system as it is. So we need to make sure that we are aligning to this. And I believe that if we focus on the outcomes and costs equation, we're essentially in a situation where we can make this a little bit too easy. But I caution all the companies out there, the tendency is to go and hire more sales reps, go and increase their activity, try and sell more, basically work harder, but they're focusing on the wrong stakeholders. So when they end up with a situation where they're doing a lot more work, and frankly, they're not getting as where they need to be. So the question becomes, how do we overcome that? And I like to use this quote from Albert Einstein. Obviously, he's a fairly intelligent guy. And he said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. So myself and Alira Health, we like to make sure that we're steering companies in the right direction, and then we're explaining it simply so all stakeholders can understand and implement what exactly it is that we're talking about. So we need to make sure that this, in the context of COVID-19, is managed appropriately. And that encompasses selling those health outcomes and articulating the total cost of that care. So let's move on to the current pandemic situation and how COVID has changed it overall. So first note is on willingness to pay from government. And I think this is absolutely crucial. A lot of people call intensive care expensive care, and there are many papers that articulate this exact phraseology. But when you put it into the patient content, I mean, just this graphic here illustrates just how much goes into managing one single patient in intensive care. There are countless machines, there are countless devices, and there are countless resources which need to be implemented in order to achieve the patient outcomes that are required. And interestingly enough, the care delivery often accounts for more than 50% of that total care. And therefore, we've seen a situation where when there is a surge capacity of critical care, governments have got a material challenge on how they actually overcome that. We've seen immediate fiscal stimuluses ranging from 10% in Germany, 3.7% in Germany, all the way down to 9.1% in the US and 4.8% in the UK. And that's not including any other deferrals of GDP expenditure. That's not including any other liquidities or guarantees and other backstops for the economy. But by any measure, the shift in healthcare value that is undertaken and the reprioritization of budgets, I think, again, in the long run will benefit MedTech companies, but we need to make sure we're linking in on this because intensive care is very expensive and governments have had to shift their spending appropriately. So let's take a quick primer on intensive care surge capacity. And really, so this is a very in-depth topic. It's quite a detailed area. And in December of 2019, there was a publication in Challenging Concepts in Critical Care in which it was articulated some critical areas for managing a pandemic. So what the experts have to say on this is that there are essentially 4 S's, if you will, of pandemic preparedness. First one is the staffing levels, okay? And as I mentioned, over 50% of critical care costs go into funding the staff members who actually run these intensive care units. So we need to make sure we're considering that when we look at how we're allocating our resources and what exactly our value propositions are for medical technologies. The second one is the stuff, and this is probably the one that MedTech is most familiar with. So this would be all of our PPE, our mechanical ventilators, it would be our pumps, it would be our consumables that go into the intensive care. But really, there's 2 ways that we need to make sure that this is allocated appropriately. First off, we need to make sure that the staff get all the appropriate resources they need. We need to make sure the public get the resources they need. But we also need to make sure that during the interpandemic period that equipment such as monitors and ventilators can be standardized and stockpiled as well. We also need to prepare for the fact that other patients will come in with other indications as well, and not just related to this pandemic. The third one is the space. So there's been calls for over 300% expansion in bed capacity. When we look at the outcomes that were associated with managing COVID in Germany, for example, they had one of the most successful rates in the world of managing the COVID admissions. And a lot of the reason that people believe that was because they had the highest per capita intensive care bed rates in all of Europe. So it begs the question, if there's enough capacity and space already there, will it lead to improved outcomes? And how can MedTech adapt to resourcing those care facilities? The fourth one is, of course, the systems. And I think this is one that's probably the most complicated, but I also believe it's the one where MedTech can align stakeholders the most and really drive value. And those would be things like applying mobile technologies to make sure that they're fully integrated with decision-making in the intensive care units. So it can enhance communication, it can facilitate strategic mapping, coordinate logistics, and improve local and international responses in a timely and cost-effective manner. As we come down this first peak, if we will, of this pandemic, I think we're starting to see these track and trace initiatives start to take hold, as well as the screening and diagnostic programs really being linked into the systems which are operating and managing this pandemic, which link back to the staff, the stuff, and the other space. So the key takeaways on each four of these for MedTech. So for staff, it's make sure that MedTech companies communicate and understand with the hospital resources. Again, you won't be able to go into the hospitals. You're not allowed to. So there has to be different ways to communicate with the staff inside the hospital facilities. In terms of stuff, needless to say, we need to make sure the supply is reaching all of the appropriate stakeholders. We saw situations in Europe where the borders were blocked and we couldn't get supplies across border. So what's the contingency plan for medical technology companies to ensure the supplies are moving freely and appropriately around the world? The space, undoubtedly, MedTech companies need to adapt to the changes within hospitals. If they're changing their patient flows, if they're changing their focus, if they're allocating resources to different areas, we need to make sure that MedTech companies have adapted appropriately. And then last but not least, on the systems side, undoubtedly the shift to digital is something that we're going to see a massive uptake on, and how we link that back into the various areas of the healthcare systems. So let's break this down a little bit into MedTech companies and how we can start to look at this from a various perspective. So for those of you who are unaware, I often prioritize my time, if you will, based on the Eisenhower matrix, which is something that links importance and urgency. And I think in a pandemic, this becomes pretty important, certainly for medical device companies. And if we look at this top right quadrant, that would be companies that have a highly urgent need and are highly important in terms of pandemic responses. And the key priorities for these companies, and these are the suppliers of PPE, they're the mechanical ventilator companies, the pumps, the consumables, and diagnostics, as I mentioned earlier. That's really to make sure that supply chains and production are fully functional, make sure that internal teams are reallocated to optimize the supply of critical medical technologies and diagnostics, to make sure your internal functions are aligned appropriately, and then ensure that new products to diagnose and manage patients with COVID are rapidly scaled up and then ethically distributed. If we look at companies that are arguably less important but highly urgent in a pandemic situation, these would be the companies that are more elective surgery based. So we see those in the cardiac interventions, oncology interventions, orthopedic areas, and then of course the associated MedTech suppliers. Ensuring that there's a digital framework and a remote consultations available to the patients and to the doctors who are running these surgical interventions, and make sure that of course that the MedTech companies themselves have got good forward-looking value propositions, such that when they launch new products in this environment, that's taken care of as well. The top left quadrant, I think this is probably one of the more interesting ones. These would be where the chronic illness suppliers start to come in. So it doesn't matter if there's a pandemic going on or not. These would be companies that have to manage the diabetes, manage the COPD indications, and make sure that the medical technologies are getting into the market. So this would be ensuring that there's a continuous supply of core products, so continuous glucose monitors, insulin delivery systems, and then of course make sure that HCPs and the healthcare workers themselves have got the resources available should questions come up on these specific technologies. The fourth area, and this is undoubtedly the companies that are going to have the biggest challenge coming out of the pandemic, these would be the capital equipment and medical imaging companies who are still looking to gain some type of market penetration into their areas. but really ensuring that their support teams can manage the existing support base, the existing installed base of existing equipment is probably going to be very important for you to consider going forward. And then I would encourage all companies in all areas of these matrix to make sure that when they think forward and they look ahead into how they're actually going to drive innovation into the system, it's a very good time to make sure that value propositions are adjusted and the necessary budget shifts are accommodated for hospital and healthcare providers. So when we look at healthcare systems themselves and we take a step back from the medical technology companies, I think this also sheds some interesting light. So there's a number of changes that we have seen throughout healthcare systems, which I think directly benefit two key areas. Number one is this concept of value-based healthcare, which aligns all stakeholders in the healthcare systems, and also for most of the audience on the line here today, and that is the MedTech industry. So let's walk through some of these individually now. So I think one of the first areas that we've seen a benefit to both MedTech and the implementation of value-based healthcare is that of the patient pathway approach. So by any measure, I think COVID-19 is being managed holistically from screening right through to diagnosis, management, and to tracking and tracing across that patient pathway. Yes, it's at different sites. Yes, there are different interventions along the way, but I think this is really the first time that we've seen a holistic approach from a patient management and a patient pathway perspective. And this links directly into integrated care systems. Definitely in Europe, and I'll use the UK as an example, we have seen integrated care systems become the default structure. We are now starting to see the importance of both health and social care being linked together, as well as the centralization of care delivery and financing and funding to make sure that the patients are managed in an optimal way. This also filters down to the payment, and again, there might be a terminology difference between Europe and the US, but essentially we're seeing more bundled and block contracting coming out. We're seeing mass purchases of medical equipments and diagnostics across the entire patient pathway en masse instead of doing it in individual fragmented silos. We're also seeing a rapid shift towards more public health initiatives, and with public health moving to the fore of decision making. So screening and diagnostic companies need to make sure they've got a rapid distribution strategy and make sure that they're accommodating the needs of government in both an ethical and efficacious way. As mentioned earlier, it's the shift to digital health. So we've seen teleconferencing appointments occur within hospitals. We've seen mobile apps. We've even seen drones flying PPE to isolated communities. And we've seen the remote monitoring of hospitalized patients and interventions as well. So undoubtedly, I think this has been a positive for digital health and the advancement of this in healthcare. Employee care, so both healthcare employees and regular staffing levels, any company, they're looking to revisit health plans to ensure employees are looked after and make sure that they look after the business, obviously, in turn. And then the biggest, and obviously the topic of this presentation, is just the MedTech value recognition. I don't recall a time where medical technologies have been more in the media and been more instrumental in propping up the healthcare system. You know, I often say that while the world waits for a vaccine, it's the medical technologies that are getting us into the, getting us past these very difficult points of time. So how can these changes benefit MedTech companies? Let's get into how this can help everyone here. So quick primer on evidence generation in MedTech. Medical devices have got a very unique way of generating evidence. You know, we're not a pharmaceutical industry. We don't have phase 1, 2, 3, and post-approval phase 4 clinical trials for drugs. But what we do have, we've got, we produce evidence of safety and efficacy for FDA or CE marking. Then the product will start to be adopted into a system, okay? As that product gets diffused into the system, that's when the uptake and adoption starts to come on board. But one of the most material challenges for healthcare companies is to overcome the physician and user learning curve. So we can give someone any product specifically. It doesn't matter if it's a mechanical ventilator for COVID, or it doesn't matter if it's a blood glucose monitor for diabetes in a relatively calm period of time. But the fact is, everyone has to learn how to use these medical technologies. And if an assessment of a medical technology for value is undertaken too early in its product life cycle, the value could be lessened, not because of the value of the product itself, but because the individual using it is not necessarily as equipped as they need to be. Therefore, we need to make sure we're balancing that off with appropriate real-world evidence generation, such that at later points of the product life cycle, we've got data points that suggest that once physicians and users are implementing the product appropriately, that evidence can substantiate the value. As we move forward across the product lifecycle, we'll start to see the value-based procurement starts to become important. As we know how the outcomes for healthcare practitioners and patients are improving, we can then start to build these into tenders and into reimbursement decisions to make sure that they're being appropriately apportioned within healthcare systems. And then, of course, we can also consider value-based access programs. One of the areas that Alira Health is focused on is what are conventionally called risk-sharing agreements. We actually call them value-based access programs because essentially they measure outcomes and costs, and they're programs that are designed to implement medical technologies. And we've mapped out about 22 to 26 of these across Europe. And if we can understand how the evidence generation cycle links into these reimbursement processes, it means that we can get the appropriate medical technologies into the companies. But if we take this standard template, if you will, of product diffusion, evidence generation, and reimbursement, it takes a life cycle approach in how we adapted this. And this product life cycle is significantly shortened in a pandemic period. We need to make sure that this is done appropriately and it's moving forward in advance. And the companies that are doing this are the ones that were already aligned to what I believe are the principles of value-based healthcare. So let's talk about this just for a minute. So again, as mentioned earlier, value-based healthcare comes out of the book by Michael Porter called Redefining Healthcare. And I believe there are about 7 or 8 different things that medical technology companies need to align with healthcare systems on to appropriately do this, okay? Now, some of them we can do quite quickly as medical tech, others we cannot, and we need to defer and engage with other stakeholders as well. But let's go through these very quickly to outline what they are. So the first one is to make sure that we're organizing our medical technologies around medical conditions, okay? If we're not looking at a medical condition approach, it can become very difficult to articulate the true value of the products. Once we understand what our product is looking to do from a medical therapeutic area position, then we need to understand what those outcomes are that will be driving the implicit value of the medical technology itself. So again, I spent a lot of time in the diabetes care space. We can talk about that. You know, what are the HbA1c reductions that we need? What are the time and range that we need to make sure that patients are achieving the outcomes that they have? Once we have the outcomes identified, then we need to make sure we're measuring the total cost of delivering the outcomes. The key point in here that I always emphasize is that it's total cost. It's not the cost of a medical technology. It's not the cost of a DRG. It's the total cost from the time the patient enters that therapeutic area to the time they leave it by being either cured or, unfortunately, sometimes in the case of death. But what is the total cost of that entire patient pathway? And then 4, the other area medical technology companies can help is moving towards reimbursement of medical conditions and not products, and that's through this concept of bundled payments. By paying for an entire patient pathway, medical technology companies have the ability to demonstrate a health economic value proposition, which means that they can articulate value across different areas and really help to drive the overall value for society and healthcare. Some of the areas which are more tricky but are also components of value-based healthcare, that includes integrating multi-site treatment centers. So if there's a digitally enabled medical technology out there that can link these various facilities of care, that's going to be of value for healthcare systems. Expand provider reach across both urban and rural care. So I come from Canada. This is actually a Canadian accent. It's always a challenge to make sure we're getting to the rural communities and making sure that they're getting as well served as those in the city centers are as well. And last but not least, probably one of the biggest areas that healthcare needs to step up on, and that is enabling IT platforms to scale up evidence and data-driven decisions. You know, there's so many fragmented electronic health records. There's even paper-based electronic records still being used. We see fax machines still being used in hospitals. You know, IT's got a long way to go, but I think it's an important enabler for value-based healthcare overall. But value-based healthcare is a bit of a long-term goal. So I often say that we need to start in bite-sized chunks. And I think the first area to start is for medical technologies in a pandemic environment is to make sure that they're linking in with the procurement processes appropriately. So I know in Europe, procurement's been one of the key enablers and sometimes one of the bigger challenges to getting the personal protective equipment and pumps and ventilators out to patients within the healthcare systems. And I would also say that goes beyond the pandemic situation as well. But really, the way procurement typically run is this red arrow on the left here where price-only decisions are being made. They're quite unilateral and they're price-only contracts that are being done. What that does is that puts the individual unit value of medical technology companies at high risk. So if they're driving down that unit price, at some point it becomes uneconomical for medical technologies to enter healthcare systems. But the procurement teams like that because it's a really short time savings. In most cases, it's shorter than 3 years, and in many cases, we see it as being less than 1 year. But that doesn't really drive value into the system too much. So by shifting to value-based procurement, we can start to extend that time horizon. We lower the individual unit value risk a little bit, and we can extend the time horizon to ideally between 3 to 5 years. And this is procurement based not only on price, but also based on outcomes and cost savings. So we've engaged in pilots in the UK with large procurement organizations, but really this is where procurement is based on outcomes achieved for health systems and patients instead of price-only decisions. It's implementable, and there are forward-looking procurement teams that will consider this, and there are hospitals that would like to implement it, but by no means is this something that is widely adopted yet, but we are seeing more and more traction as we shift towards value-based healthcare. In terms of value-based healthcare overall, it's a much longer time horizon, and the individual unit value risk for medical technology companies is much lower. But I think that this will be a longer-term strategy that everyone could work towards by implementing the outcomes and costs approach that we've already talked about. And some key points on this. So approximately 70% of all medical technology companies reach the users through some form of procurement. So ensuring we're targeting these stakeholders appropriately is absolutely essential. And again, the companies that are most prepared to do this prior to a pandemic are going to be the ones that can do this most effectively during a pandemic as well. So we need to make sure that this stakeholder is managed appropriately. Traditionally, tenders are conducted by stakeholders who are measured on reducing costs. So we need to make sure we're shifting that focus away. And again, in Europe, we've seen a lot of European procurement legislation designed to do exactly this. And MedTech has to look at, as I mentioned, the health outcomes and the total costs. On the costing side, it's about changing from not only acquisition costs, but also to avoided costs down the road. And that's where the health economic perspective can really lend a lot of value to the procurement process as well. But really, the key takeaway here is that value-based procurement is a stepping stone. It's a midterm solution to transforming the health towards a value-based healthcare system overall. But I do believe it's something that we need to look into going forward. So let's talk about aligning our organization. So as mentioned here through this pandemic Eisenhower matrix, depending on where your company fits, will have various implications for this. But there are a number of things that we need to do. So I've already gone through the value-based healthcare shift. I don't need to do it again, but it's here as a reminder. This is how healthcare systems are transforming. It's up to us as medical technology companies to align to it. One of the areas that we can most effectively do this is by understanding what payers and procurement teams are asking for. And I've done a number of diagnostics with companies that outline and understand these key questions before we can go any further, okay? So the key questions that payers will ask is, what is the unmet need of the technology? If a company, if any of us on the phone or on the call now cannot answer what the unmet need of our medical technologies are, I believe we have a long way to go before we'll achieve successful market access for our products, and certainly for payer engagement and reimbursement. The second question is, the payers are going to ask, what am I currently paying? Now, this obviously won't be for your technologies, but it will be for what the existing standard of care is. If we cannot answer that question, it's very difficult to articulate what the incremental benefit is. And that segues into question 3. How is your solution better than the alternatives? So if we've got two different products, both looking to offer the same patient outcome, what makes your product better than the alternate? And it's shocking how many companies have not thought about this from a payer perspective. How much is your device and why is it worth it? So question 2 is, what am I currently paying? That's nothing to do with your technology itself, but how much is your specific device and why is it worth it? That's where the underlying evidence generation becomes critical, as well as the economic costing models that are put on top of it. Another question is, can I afford your device? So again, we talked about one of the challenges healthcare systems face, and that is shrinking budgets. So if budgets are shrinking, are we sure healthcare systems can even afford the product that you're looking to put into a system? Again, this is coming from a diabetes care space where this is probably one of the most acute challenges. Companies will often say, well, we want to target all type 2 patients in diabetes. Healthcare systems just cannot afford it. So it might be worthwhile to stratify your patient populations and expand indications afterwards. Question 6, what are the consequences of not funding this? This is not a popular question to put to commercial teams, but payers will often say, if I don't fund this, what difference does it make? I think it's very prudent for companies to have an answer to this question well in advance of product launch, or even after they have discussions with payers. And then last but not least, bringing us full circle on the what is the unmet need is which patients should get this. If we cannot clearly identify which patients should be receiving this intervention, I think it leads to a lot of challenges that will frustrate payers and potentially lead to lower revenue opportunities for companies down the road. And those are the questions that payers will ask. And once we've aligned on all of these different pillars, then we can start to get into how MedTech can actually implement this. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go through this quite quickly. But the first one is to link our products back to therapeutic areas into a strong evidence base. And this can be done through an alignment with what we call a PICO framework. If you're not sure what a PICO framework is, by all means, reach out to me. I can certainly give you some information on that. But this really helps to define what it is we're looking to do as a market access project or a reimbursement project for technologies. Number 2 is to develop patient cohorts with risk-adjusted criteria and protocols. And again, if your evidence generation plan needs a second look, this is where it will often come to fruition. So if you're not quite sure on who your patients are, then you might need to rethink how you're going to be engaging on your product. Number 3, define clear outcome measures for cohorted patients. So again, in this pandemic situation, we know that we need to get the patients out of the intensive care units and back home as quickly as possible. And we need to make sure that those outcome measures are clearly defined. Once we've defined those, then we need to understand what the time frame to achieving those outcomes are. And this is where real-world evidence can really lend itself to this solution. So, if we see some of the chronic illnesses, let's take COPD as an example, if we believe that the patient outcomes occur after 5 to 10 years, and if the payers are on a 1 to 2 year budget cycle, there's a big gap there. So we need to make sure the evidence generation and the patient outcomes are aligned to the economic ones as well. Then we need to make sure we've quantified the baseline costs and outcomes for each patient cohort. And this really allows us to understand how much of an incremental improvement our technologies can start to put into systems. Then we need to determine the prospective outcomes and cost improvement as well. So once we know the baseline, what's that incremental benefit going to be? And then number 7, we need to have a simple business model developed. And that really takes on 2 ways. The first one is internally, so we can align our internal commercial teams. And then the second one is also for payers themselves. If it's a relatively small intervention with not too many patients, payers may deprioritize that if it's not something that there's a robust business model built for. So by understanding the patient and therapeutic area benefits, and then of course the economic and business fundamentals, I think MedTech companies will be well positioned for the pandemic. And I think that this is still very, very important, even as we appear to be coming down off of this first wave of the pandemic. So if we look at the Spanish flu, 1918, 1919, 1920, the second wave was actually the worst one. And I'm really hopeful that we don't see a second wave of a magnitude to the first wave for COVID that we're seeing on the Spanish flu, because that could be something that could be devastating for both economies and patients around the world. But either way, I do believe it's prudent to plan. We saw a similar thing with SARS in 2003 in Ontario, Canada, where I'm from. But we saw the phase 1 was the bigger of the 2 waves, but there was definitely a pronounced second wave. So really the question that I want to put out there to everyone is, are you prepared and have you got your plan in place for the staff, the stuff, the supplies, and the systems, and how it relates to your medical technologies for that second wave of a potential second wave of COVID? And I just want to cap off with a quick comment on leadership through all of this, because as health systems have struggled around the world, I think it's the systems that have got the strongest leaders that have done best. And Jeremy Farrar of the Wellcome Trust has articulated this very well in the critical care book that I referred to earlier. And he said, deaths resulting from a new pandemic will be regrettable. Those that result from insufficient planning, inequitable allocation of resources, and inadequate preparation will be especially tragic. So my challenge out there to everyone is to make sure that your technologies are clearly understood in the current ecosystem, and we know exactly how they will fit into the value-based solutions, so we can help the patients get out of intensive care and deal with the pandemic most appropriately. And even those patients who are not impacted by COVID, I think we can open it up to them as well. So with that, I went a little bit over time, but hopefully we can address some questions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Richard. Fantastic presentation. Lots of really insightful information in there. Like you mentioned, we do have just about 5 minutes for questions here, and we do have some coming in. If you do have any additional questions, please feel free to go ahead and enter those in on the right-hand side right now. But we'll go ahead and get to the first one. Michael asks, can you speak to the increase of interest in smart medical devices in response to the current situation? I know that's kind of a broad question.
Yeah, it is fairly broad, but I think it's really an intuitive response, and that is, in a socially distanced world, in many cases, digital has to be implemented because we're not allowed to have face-to-face interaction. So again, I know there are initiatives in place in London. I'm in London, England right now. There's initiatives in place where there's iPads being given out to make sure that remote access can be achieved for families and carers in the intensive care unit. There are remote consultations going on for some of the surgeries, and that's just because people cannot be physically present. So, digital tracing. I mean, if these apps are out there to track the symptoms of COVID, I mean, you don't need to be face to face to do that. So I think the remote nature of digital lends itself to a pandemic environment, and therefore we've seen a pickup of it.
Awesome, thank you. Alrighty, and Becky asks, can you give some examples of reimbursement of medical conditions versus reimbursement of medical products?
Yeah, so a clear one actually is in diabetes. So Diabetes in the Netherlands, they're a type 1 indication, and essentially they have patients admitted and they're reimbursed across the entire type 1 patient pathway. And then, of course, the government will release funding based on that. So there's one. We've also seen orthopedics do this as well. So I know companies like Stryker, they've got a big bundle payment initiative where orthopedic patient pathways are looked at and reimbursed for. So we are starting to see them bubble up. I think the real advantage to these are that for medical technology companies, it takes us out of the confines of a DRG and allows the medical technology to deliver more value across the patient pathway. So if we can take these examples, which are admittedly embryonic at this point, I think we can start to scale them up.
Awesome. All right, and don't have a name here. Next question, we have any user cases or resources regarding value-based procurement systems?
I can say myself. So again, I was one of the core contributors to the Value-Based Procurement Initiative at MedTech Europe here, where we kicked this off. So I would never recommend reading European legislation. It'll put anyone to sleep. But really, the EU Procurement Directive has got a lot of interesting stuff on there on how you can start to do this. University of Liverpool here in the UK, they've done a fantastic piece on step-by-step implementation. But really, one of the core work streams we undertake at Alira Health is preparing companies for value-based procurement. So again, we are also one at Alira Health.
Awesome, thank you. And we'll do one final question here. Gianluca asks, can you speak to the approach that startups should take when approaching venture capitalists in a climate in which may seem investors are being rather hesitant?
Yeah, so again, I think that you have to put yourself in the perspective of venture capitalists and what do they want. And really, venture capitalists want to know they're going to get a return on investment. So then how do you get a return on investment? That's to ensure your product can be commercialized. If you're going to commercialize your product, you really need to make sure you've got it mapped out how you're going to generate the revenue. If you're going to generate the revenue, I think you need to make sure you've got a very clear payer approach. So that's where market access comes in. And if you're going to approach a payer, you need to make sure you've got the good clinical evidence and the health economic modeling to ensure that they're going to reimburse you for your product. So from my perspective, I think you really need to make sure you've got the commercialization process down by having a market access process embedded into your commercialization so you can articulate that to venture capitalists at an early stage in your product development.
All righty, Richard. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Richard Charter, Vice President of MedTech Market Access, Europe and Asia Pacific for Alira Health. Fantastic presentation. Richard, where can people find out more about Alira Health? How can they get in touch with you?
So you can visit our website at Alira Health, or you can find me on LinkedIn. I can certainly follow up with you. But yeah, just Google Alira Health and you'll find a lot of good content.
Awesome. So thank you so much. Fantastic presentation. And everybody, our next presentation will be starting in just about 10 minutes. Hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.